60 miles per hour, no brakes, no way off, a log weighing 3,000 pounds, hurtling down a wooden trough barely 4 feet wide, dropping 4,000 vertical feet across 10 miles of mountain. The trip took 15 minutes, faster than any horse could gallop, faster than early trains, and some men rode these things for a living. They called them flume herders. They walked the edges of wooden highways suspended over canyons, watching for jams, listening for the roar of incoming timber. When the logs came, they had seconds to get clear or become part of the cargo. A man named Erik Lindqvist started riding the flumes at 17 years old, Norwegian immigrant, arrived in California with nothing but a canvas bag and a letter from his mother telling him to find honest work. By 23, he'd watched 6 men die on the wooden highways. By 28, he'd buried 2 of them himself, hauling bodies down trails too steep for mules. He kept working. The money went home to Minnesota. His mother never knew how her son earned it. This is the story of America's forgotten gravity highways, the V-flumes and log chutes that move more timber than any railroad could haul. We're going to talk about how they built 10-mile wooden structures through impossible terrain using nothing but muscle and mathematics. We're going to talk about the water systems that kept the whole operation from burning to ash. And we're going to talk about the men who rode these things and why so many of them never made it to the bottom. But first, you need to understand the hunger that built these highways in the sky. The railroads were starving. San Francisco alone consumed over 300 million board feet of lumber every year in the 1870s. The city kept burning down, and they kept rebuilding it with wood. Frame houses, warehouses, wharves. The demand never stopped. But San Francisco was nothing compared to Virginia City. The Comstock lode, the richest silver deposit ever discovered in North America, sat under the mountains of Nevada. And those mines swallowed timber like nothing the world had ever seen. 600 million board feet consumed just to shore up the tunnels. Timbers bracing the walls. Timbers holding up the ceilings. Timbers keeping the mountain from collapsing on the thousands of men digging out silver worth billions. Every day, the mines went deeper. Every day, they needed more wood. The forests of Nevada were gone within years. The forests of the eastern Sierra followed. They looked west, to the slopes above California, where sugar pines and ponderosa stood in endless ranks, trees so massive a single trunk could yield 10,000 board feet of lumber. The trees existed, the demand existed. The problem was everything in between. Those forests stood 8,000 feet up. The mills sat in the valleys below. And in between lay some of the most brutal terrain on the North American continent. Sierra Nevada slopes hit 40 to 60% grades. And that's not a hill, that's a wall. Standing upright was a challenge. Walking was exhausting. Dragging anything, a tool, a timber, a body, was nearly impossible. Horses couldn't haul on those grades. They sank in mud. They slipped on granite. They broke their legs on slopes that shouldn't have been attempted. Wagons couldn't roll. The wheels locked. As the brakes failed, the whole rig tumbled into ravines and took the teamsters with it. Oxen fared no better. They were stronger than horses, but just as mortal. The mountain killed them all the same. You couldn't build roads. The grades were impossible. The terrain too broken. Switchbacks that would have taken years to construct. Bridges that couldn't be anchored. Cuts through solid granite that no amount of blasting could achieve in time. And the timber barons didn't have time. The mines were hungry now. San Francisco was burning now. Every day without lumber was money bleeding into the ground. So they looked at the mountain and asked a different question. What if they didn't fight the slope? What if they used it? That's when a man named James W. Haynes showed up with something nobody had ever seen. Haynes was an engineer who understood water. He'd worked on mining operations, seen how sluices moved gravel and ore. He looked at the Sierra Nevada and saw what others couldn't. A highway that didn't need horses, didn't need engines, didn't need anything except the slope of the earth and enough water to keep the wood from catching fire. The concept was elegantly simple. Build a V-shaped wooden trough, fill it with running water, tip it downhill, let gravity do the work, Logs would float in the water, ride the current, slide down the mountain mile after mile until they reached the mills in the valleys below. No horses, no engines, no roads through impossible terrain, just wood and water and the unstoppable pull of the earth. But here's the thing about simple concepts. The execution was anything but simple. Building a flume through the Sierra Nevada meant constructing a wooden structure across terrain that didn't want structures of any kind. Every board had to be cut on site. You couldn't haul lumber up slopes that steep. Every nail had to be carried in by men on foot. Every trestle spanning a ravine had to be assembled piece by piece while workers hung over drops that would kill them if they slipped. Haynes's Sierraville flume stretched 10.5 miles when completed. 10.5 miles of wooden trough, 3 feet deep, 4 feet wide, following the natural contours of the mountainside. Bridges over ravines, curves banked like racetracks, trestles standing 80 feet tall over canyon floors. The gradient had to be precise. Too steep, and the logs would fly out of the trough at the curves, becoming 3,000-pound missiles that destroyed everything in their path. Too shallow, and the logs would jam, backing up miles of timber until the pressure blew out the flume walls. The sweet spot was about 200 feet of drop per mile, enough to keep momentum, not enough to lose control. Every section had to be surveyed, calculated, adjusted for the terrain. And all of it had to be built by hand, by men earning $2 a day, at working dawn to dark in conditions that would kill half of them before the decade was out. But here's the genius part. Here's what made the V-flume possible when every other solution had failed. Water. A V-flume wasn't just a wooden slide, it was a controlled river. 15,000 gallons per minute flowed through the troughs, diverted from mountain streams through elaborate systems of dams and feeder ditches. The water served multiple purposes, but the most critical one was this: keeping the wood from catching fire. When a 3,000-pound log slides down a wooden trough at 60 miles per hour, friction generates heat. A lot of heat. Without water, the contact between moving timber and stationary lumber would heat the flume walls within minutes. The wood would start to smoke, then char, then ignite. A dry flume was a dead flume, and everyone on it was dead too. So they built water systems as elaborate as the flumes themselves. On diversion dams captured mountain streams and redirected them into channels that fed the flume heads. Gravity carried the water down alongside the timber, a constant flow that kept everything wet, kept everything cool, kept everything alive. The men who maintained this flow were called flume tenders. They walked the edges of the structure, often alone, often miles from anyone else. Their job was to keep the water running and to spot trouble before it became disaster. A debris jam in a feeder ditch could cut water flow within minutes. A fallen tree across the flume could stop logs dead and start a backup that would destroy half a mile of structure. A leak in the trough walls could drain enough water to let the friction heat build up. The flume tenders walked and watched and listened. The sound of proper flow became as familiar as their own heartbeat. They could hear when something was wrong, a change in the rush of water, a different pitch in the timber creaking. They developed instincts that no manual could teach. But here's what they listened for most carefully: the roar. When logs entered the flume at the top, they picked up speed fast. Within a quarter mile, they were moving at 40 miles per hour. Within a mile, 60. At those speeds, the mass of timber displaced water and air in ways that announced their coming like thunder rolling down the canyon. You heard the roar before you saw the logs. A low rumble building to a continuous thunder. If you were standing on the flume edge when you heard it, you had maybe 15 seconds to get clear. 15 seconds. That's all that separated the living from the dead. The tenders learned to work with one ear, always listening. They learned where the sight lines were good and where the curves blocked vision until it was too late. They learned to stay light on their feet, always ready to leap sideways off the trestle onto solid ground. And some of them got good at it. Some of them worked for years, reading the flume like a living thing, staying alive through skill and instinct and luck. And some of them misjudged. Once. But the V-flumes, dangerous as they were, looked almost safe compared to the alternative. Let's talk about the dry chutes. And let's talk about why some men called them suicide slides. Not every operation could afford a V flume. The water systems required streams in the right locations, like elaborate diversion infrastructure, constant maintenance of flow. Some terrain didn't cooperate, some companies didn't have the capital, so they built dry chutes instead. Log slides, wooden troughs with no water at all. The concept was the same: let gravity do the work. But without water to reduce friction, they had to find other ways to keep the logs moving and the wood from igniting. They greased the chutes with dogfish oil, tallow, and sometimes just water hauled up in barrels and sloshed across the surface. It wasn't enough. Dry chutes ran hotter and faster than any V flume. Logs hit 90 miles per hour on steep pitches. At that speed, wood doesn't slide, it flies. The construction was simpler: parallel logs forming a trough, following ridge lines down the mountain. Cheaper to build, faster to construct. But the simplicity came with a price. Logs don't steer. When a chute curved, like the timber was supposed to follow the banking like a bobsled on a track. When the grease was fresh and the curve was gentle, it worked. When the grease wore thin or the curve was sharp or the log hit a rough patch, it jumped the rails. A log jumping a dry chute at 90 miles per hour doesn't fall gracefully. It launches. It becomes a projectile weighing 3,000 pounds, traveling fast enough to punch through a wooden building without slowing down. Fast enough to kill a man so quickly he never knew what hit him. And somebody had to ride these things before the day's run. They called it the goat, or sometimes the go-devil, a crude sled-like contraption that workers used to check the chute condition before the logs started flowing. Somebody had to ride down the entire length, 10 miles or more, looking for obstructions, testing the grease, verifying the curves still held. The men who rode the goats were paid extra. Not much extra, maybe 50 cents more per day. But it was enough to get volunteers because there were always men desperate enough to trade their odds of survival for 50 cents. They would start at the top, settle onto the goat, and let go. No brakes, no way to stop, just a wooden sled under them and a 10-mile drop ahead. If the chute was in good shape, the ride took maybe 15 minutes of pure controlled terror. The wind in your face, the wood screaming beneath you. The curves coming up so fast you barely had time to shift your weight before you were through them and dropping into the next straight section. If the chute wasn't in good shape, an obstruction, a rough patch, a curve that had warped in the weather, you found out the hard way. And by then, it was too late to do anything about it. The men who rode the goats and survived were legends in the camps. They told stories about runs where the sled nearly jumped the track, or about seeing death coming and somehow twisting clear, about reaching the bottom with splinters in their hands and their hearts pounding so hard they could hear nothing else. The men who didn't survive, well, nobody told stories about them. There were too many to tell. One chute could move 100,000 board feet of lumber per day. No horses, no engines, just the slope of the earth and men willing to risk everything on a wooden track. They built 10-mile highways through mountains. The only fuel was gravity. The only brakes were prayer. Now, let's talk about who these men actually were and why they stayed. They came from Norway, Sweden, Finland, Scandinavian immigrants who knew cold and forests and hard work. They came from failed farms in Wisconsin and Minnesota, men who'd watched their crops die 3 years running and had nothing left to lose. They came from played-out mines in Colorado and Nevada, men who'd already gambled their health for ore and were willing to gamble what remained for timber. Chinese laborers built the flumes themselves, the most dangerous construction work of all. They hung trestles off cliff faces, fitted lumber in positions no other workers would take, suspended by ropes over drops that would kill them if the ropes failed. When the construction was done, some of them stayed on as flume workers. The mountains didn't care about race. They killed everyone equally. $2 to $4 a day. That was the wage. Good money for the 1880s. More than farm labor, more than factory work, more than most men could earn anywhere else. But the work explained why they paid it. Most were young. 20, 22, 25. Young enough to be fearless, or at least foolish enough to fake it. Young enough to believe that death happened to other men, not to them. Most were single, no wives, no children, no attachments that would miss them if they didn't come home. The companies preferred it that way. Single men had no one to write letters to, no families to show up demanding answers when the silence stretched too long. A man named Thomas Erickson, no relation to the other Erickson, there were dozens in the camps, started work on the flumes at 19. Big for his age, hands like shovels. He could carry a timber that took 2 other men to lift. By 24, he'd watched 9 men die. 3 fell from trestles. 2 were crushed by jams releasing without warning. 1 was taken by a log jumping a curve. They never found all of him. 1 burned when a dry chute ignited. 2 just disappeared into ravines. Their bodies never recovered. 9 men, 5 years. And Thomas kept working. When asked why, years later, he said something that every flume worker would have understood. The money was good. There wasn't other work. And I figured if it was my time, worrying about it wouldn't change nothing. That was the culture. Fatalism as survival mechanism. If it's your time, it's your time. You couldn't outrun the mountain. You couldn't bargain with gravity. You worked, you collected your pay, and you either survived to spend it or you didn't. They didn't come for adventure. They came because there was nothing else. Let's talk about how they lived, because understanding the camps helps you understand why death was almost a relief. Crude wooden shacks at flume heads, bunkhouses at intervals along the line. The structures were built fast and maintained never. Gaps in the walls let wind through in winter. Leaking roofs turned the floors to mud in spring. The camps were constructed to shelter men the way a barn sheltered livestock. Minimally, temporarily, without sentiment. 20 men in a room built for 10. Bunks stacked 3 high, packed so close you could feel the body heat of the men on either side of you. Less in the mattresses. Everyone had them, everyone scratched. The smell of sweat and wood smoke and wet wool that never quite dried, no matter how close you put it to the stove. Food was monotony given form. Beans, salt pork, coffee black enough to stand a spoon in, maybe molasses on Sunday if the cook was feeling generous. The cooks worked fast and seasoned nothing. The point wasn't enjoyment, the point was calories. A man named Huang Wei, who worked the Tuolum Ne Flume for 7 years, and later said the food was worse than anything he'd eaten in China, worse than the ship that brought him over. At least on the ship, he said, they knew we had to survive the voyage. In the camps, they didn't care if we survived or not. Dawn to dark, 6 days a week. 7 during peak season when the weather was good and the timber barons were screaming for production. No days off unless you were injured, and injured men didn't get paid. So they worked through injuries until the injuries killed them or healed wrong. The isolation was total. Miles from any town. No women except those who arrived occasionally in wagons and left the same night, taking the men's wages with them. No churches, no schools, no law except what the camp boss enforced with his fists and his reputation. A camp boss named Sullivan ran operations on the Madeira flume system. The men called him Sledge, not because he hit anyone, but because he never stopped. Dawn to dark alongside his crew. First one up, last one down. When a flume section collapsed in '84, Sullivan worked 40 straight hours directing repairs while the company owners telegraphed demands about lost production. Sullivan had a rule. You didn't complain, you didn't ask for time off, you didn't question orders. But he had another rule too. You didn't abandon your men. When a tender named Aronson fell and broke both legs, Sullivan carried him 4 miles down the mountain on his back. When a crew got caught in an early blizzard, Sullivan stayed with them for 3 days, rationing food, keeping them moving so they wouldn't freeze. The men respected Sullivan. They feared him too, but mostly they understood him. He was one of them, shaped by the same forces, broken in the same ways. Payday came once a month. The wages meant 2 things: send money home or drink it before dawn. Most of them sent at least some money back. Mothers in Norway, sisters in Minnesota, wives they'd left behind with promises to send for them when they had enough saved. The money kept families alive across an ocean and a continent. What remained after the money went home usually went to whiskey. The camps didn't have much, but they always had alcohol. Cards and drinking and fighting. That was entertainment. That was how you forgot, for a few hours, what tomorrow looked like. But here's the thing about living that close together, working that hard, facing that much danger day after day. It created something. Brotherhood. The man upstream controlled your life. Think about that for a moment. Someone you might not even like, someone you might have fought with last week over cards or whiskey, held your existence in his hands. When he released logs into the flume, he determined whether you lived or died based on his timing, his attention, his judgment. Trust wasn't optional. Trust was survival. They developed signal systems, horns, flags, shouts that echoed through canyons. Before releasing a log run, the man at the top would sound a horn. The sound would carry down the mountain, and every tender along the line would hear it, would know what was coming, would get clear of the flume edge. But sound travels strangely in canyons. Sometimes the horn didn't carry. Sometimes the wind swallowed it. Sometimes a man was working with his back to the sound, focused on a jam or a leak, and didn't hear until it was too late. So they watched out for each other. If you saw a man too close to the edge when a run was coming, you didn't wait to see if he'd heard the horn. You ran to him, you grabbed him. You pulled him clear whether he wanted to be pulled or not. The unwritten rules were iron. You didn't abandon a man. If someone got hurt, you stopped what you were doing and you helped. You shared rations with anyone who ran short. You carried the injured out, even if it took all night, even if it meant leaving the flume unwalked. A herder named Thomas Riley spent 16 hours climbing down a ravine to reach Anson Drake, who'd fallen 200 feet when a trestle gave way. Drake was still alive, barely. Broken ribs, broken leg, blood everywhere. The company would have left him to die. Riley didn't. He carried Drake out on his back. Like straight up a slope that would have killed a mule, 16 hours of climbing with a dying man on his shoulders. When they finally reached the camp, Riley collapsed and didn't wake up for 2 days. Drake lost his left leg. He spent the rest of his life telling the story of the man who wouldn't leave him. Years later, when Riley died of pneumonia in a boarding house in Sacramento, Drake traveled 400 miles to attend the funeral. That was brotherhood, not sentimentality. Not friendship in any soft sense, just an understanding, forged in shared hardship, that the men beside you were the only thing standing between you and the mountain. Some men stayed for decades, some died their first week. The mountain didn't distinguish, but brotherhood couldn't stop what was coming. Let's talk about how these men died. Logs jumped the flume. Men didn't jump fast enough. Jams released without warning. Walls of timber buried workers in seconds. The chutes caught fire. Men burned with them. Cables snapped, steel whips moving at 100 miles per hour, cutting through everything in their path. Falls from the flume, hundreds of feet straight down into ravines that no one would climb to recover a body. Let me be specific. Let me tell you exactly what happened to men on these wooden highways, because the specificity matters. The details are what separate history from myth. When a log jumped a flume curve, it didn't tip over gracefully. It launched. It was a 3,000-pound mass of timber moving at 60 miles per hour, suddenly airborne, traveling in whatever direction its momentum carried it. If a man was in that direction, walking the edge, checking the water flow, bending down to clear debris, he had no warning and no chance. The log would strike him with the force of a speeding truck, and the results were the same as being hit by a speeding truck. A flume tender named Patrick Sutherland went over the edge near Tuolumne in 1888. When 23 years old, he'd been on the line for 8 months, long enough to know the work, not long enough to develop the instincts that might have saved him. A log jumped the curve at what witnesses said was 50 miles per hour. Sutherland was walking the edge, looking for debris. The log took him and didn't stop. They never found his body. The canyon swallowed everything. The log, the man, whatever remained of either. When jams released, the violence was different, but just as final. Logs would pile up at a curve or a narrow section, each new arrival adding to the pressure until thousands of pounds of timber were stacked against each other, creaking and groaning like something alive. Someone had to clear those jams, usually by finding the key log and working it free, letting the rest cascade down the flume. The problem was that jams were unstable. They could release at any moment, without warning. A man working to free the key log might succeed too well, might find himself suddenly in the path of 100 logs, all moving at once, released like a dam breaking. William Sung was 31 when a jam release caught him on the Kings River flume. Chinese immigrant. He'd been with the company for 3 years, one of the workers who'd stayed on after construction. He knew the flume as well as anyone alive. The jam released while he was still on the edge. But witnesses said he had maybe 2 seconds of warning, enough time to turn, not enough time to run. The wall of timber took him over the side and into the canyon. Like Sutherland, he was never recovered. The dry chutes caught fire more often than anyone wanted to admit. Without constant water flow, friction built up. The grease they applied wore off. On a hot day, with the wrong conditions, a spark could start somewhere in the middle of the run and spread faster than anyone could respond. A fire on a dry chute created a unique horror. Men trapped on a structure that was actively burning, with timber still coming down from above. You couldn't go up. The logs were still flowing. You couldn't go down. The fire was spreading that direction. You couldn't jump off. The chute crossed a ravine 100 feet deep. The records don't name most of the men who died in chute fires. The companies didn't keep those records, or didn't keep them well. But survivors described what they saw. Men trying to outrun the flames, men leaping off the chute and falling, men who just stopped moving and let the fire take them because there was nowhere else to go. They didn't count the deaths. They counted the board feet. Production was the metric that mattered. How many logs made it down? How much lumber reached the mills? The men were line items, replaceable, forgotten the moment their wages stopped. And those were the everyday deaths, the routine deaths, the deaths that happened often enough that men stopped being surprised by them. Then came the disasters. In the spring of 1891, a trestle section on the Kings River flume gave way without warning. The winter had been harsh, more snow than usual, more ice, more freeze-thaw cycles that worked at the joints of the wooden structure. The trestle had been weakened for months, ice expansion cracking the joints, water rot softening the lumber where it met the supports. No one had inspected it closely enough. No one had time. Production was behind schedule, the company was demanding more output, and inspection meant shutting down sections of the flume. Shutting down meant lost money. Lost money meant angry telegrams from San Francisco. So the trestle stood, weakened and waiting. 4 men were working the section that morning, routine maintenance, checking the water flow, clearing debris from the previous day's run. They had no warning. The trestle simply gave way beneath them, the wood snapping like gunshots, the whole structure dropping into the canyon below. 2 of them fell with the wreckage. Michael Torvald and William Sung, whose story I told you earlier. 2 managed to grab the remaining structure and hang on while 300 feet of flume dropped away beneath them, clinging to boards that might give way any second. The 2 survivors held on for 6 hours before rescue reached them. 6 hours suspended over a 200-foot drop, on arms screaming, hands bleeding, not knowing if the next board would hold or if they'd fall like their friends had fallen. Torvald was 26. He'd left a wife in Oakland, a woman named Karen, who was expecting their first child. He sent money home every month. He'd promised he'd be home by fall, that they'd have enough saved to buy a small house, that the danger would end. His body was found 3 days later, tangled in wreckage at the canyon bottom. The company sent Karen Torvald a letter expressing regret. They sent her Michael's final wages, $17 for the partial month he'd worked. No compensation, no pension, no acknowledgement that their failure to inspect the trestle had killed her husband. The pattern repeated across the Sierra. The Madera flume lost 8 men in a single year, 1887, when a spring flood weakened supports that weren't reinforced in time. The Tuolumne operation buried 3 workers in a jam release that might have been prevented if the company had heeded warnings about the curb's banking. Each death was treated as bad luck, an accident, the cost of doing business. The companies expressed regret and hired replacement workers and went back to counting board feet. They held no funerals. They built no monuments. The men who died were buried in small cemeteries near the camps, if their bodies were recovered. If not, they simply disappeared, their names forgotten within months. By the following week, after any disaster, new men were walking the same flume sections. The timber barons were still hungry. San Francisco was still burning. Virginia City still needed shoring. If you think men like Torvald and Sung deserve to be remembered, subscribe. Their names are almost gone from history. We can keep them. And still, they came back. Every morning, the survivors returned to the flumes. Every morning, they walked out onto structures that had killed their friends, listened for the roar, watched for the signs of trouble. Why? Because there was nowhere else to go. The wages were better than farm labor, better than the mines, which killed you slower, but just as surely, black lung, cave-ins, the gradual destruction of your body through years of underground work. Better than unemployment, which killed your family while you watched them starve. There was no workers' compensation, no insurance, no safety regulations. If you got hurt, you stopped working. If you stopped working, you stopped getting paid. If you stopped getting paid, your family stopped eating. The choice wasn't between dangerous work and safe work. The choice was between dangerous work and nothing. And there was something else. Something harder to explain, but just as real. Pride. You knew what the job was, a flume herder named Olaf Henriksen said in a letter that survived him. You took it anyway. A man doesn't complain about the work he chose. Henriksen survived 31 years on the flumes. He watched the industry change around him. He buried friends. He trained boys who wouldn't live to become men. He never complained. Not once, in any surviving record. He simply worked, collected his pay, sent money home, and went back out the next morning. The culture was Stoicism carried to its logical extreme. Complaining was weakness. Fear was personal. You might feel it, but you never showed it. If it was your time, it was your time. You couldn't outrun the mountain. You couldn't bargain with gravity. All you could do was work and survive as long as the surviving lasted. What families knew was mostly nothing. Women and children waited in towns 100 miles away, in cities across the ocean. Some received letters, some received money. Some received nothing but silence that stretched until they understood what the silence meant. You know, the company owed you wages through your last day of work. Death settled the account. Nothing more was owed, legally or otherwise. Some men walked away, some worked a season or two, saved what they could, and left for other work. But most stayed until they couldn't stay anymore, until age or injury or death ended their careers. The work continued. It always continued. The timber barons were hungry, and the mountains had timber, and gravity still worked the way it always had. And eventually, the flumes fell silent, not because of the deaths. The companies didn't care about the deaths. They'd proven that, year after year, replacing the fallen without ceremony or pause. The flumes ended because something better came along. Logging railroads reached into the mountains by the 1890s. Steel rails could carry more timber, faster, with fewer men. The grades that had defeated wagons and horses couldn't defeat locomotives with specialized gearing. The railroads could haul year-round, and not just when the water flow was right. They could carry equipment and supplies up the mountain as well as timber down. And then trucks came. Gasoline engines that could climb grades no railroad ever reached, that could go where no tracks had been laid, that could adapt to terrain that changed with every harvest. The last major V-flumes fell silent in the 1920s. Some of the dry chutes lasted a bit longer. They were cheaper to build, easier to relocate as the timber was cut out. But by the 1930s, the era was over. The wooden highways that had moved hundreds of millions of board feet, that had killed hundreds of men, that had fed the hunger of San Francisco and Virginia City and 1,000 other places, they simply couldn't compete. But they left something behind. If you hike the backcountry of the Sierra Nevada today, you'll find them. Rotting trestles still stand in some canyons. The wood is grayed and softened with a century of weather. But the structures remain, testament to the engineering that went into them. Collapsed troughs lie half buried in ferns and pine needles. The V-shape still visible if you know what you're looking at. The cuts are still there in the granite where they anchored the supports, drill holes that held bolts, grooves where cables ran. The rock remembers what the wood has forgotten. Parallel depressions mark old chute routes, the ground still compressed from the passage of thousands of logs. Chute trees have grown up through the old slides, their roots working through timber that was placed before their seeds were dropped, and the stumps. Thousands of old-growth stumps still standing, each one bearing the signature of the men who worked here. Springboard notches cut into the sides, the slots where loggers stood to make their cuts above the flared base of the trunk. Saw marks frozen in time, the pattern of the blade still visible in wood that hasn't rotted in 100 years. Some stumps are 12 feet across, the remains of trees that were already old when Columbus sailed. The stumps are monuments, though no one built them as such. They mark where men stood, where they worked, where they brought down giants, and fed them into the wooden highways. Some of the flume routes have become hiking trails. The grades are gentle. They had to be, to control the logs. And they wind through country that most people never see. If you walk them, you're walking where the flume tenders walked, where they listened for the roar, where some of them took their last steps. The water still trickles through some sections. Where the diversion dams once stood, streams still flow. Where the troughs once carried 15,000 gallons a minute, creeks run through the same channels, following gravity the same way the lumber did. The machines are gone, the men are gone, but the mountain remembers. And now, let me tell you what we've lost. When everything we built on their labor. The lumber that framed San Francisco's Victorians, the ones that survived the fire and the earthquake, came down on flumes. Men like Eric Lindqvist and Thomas Erickson and Patrick Sutherland cut those trees, built those flumes, died on those slopes so that people 100 miles away could have houses. The timber that shored up the Comstock mines, that kept the tunnels open while men dug out silver worth billions, it rode the wooden highways. Without that lumber, the mines would have collapsed. Without the mines, Virginia City wouldn't have existed. Without Virginia City, the western expansion would have happened differently, more slowly, perhaps not at all. We've gained so much since then. Safety regulations, OSHA, workers' compensation, insurance, training programs and certification requirements, and hard hats and safety harnesses. A modern logging operation would horrify a 19th century timber baron. Too much caution. Too many rules, too much concern for the men doing the work. That's a good thing. That's progress. The men who died on the flumes would have wanted better for their children and grandchildren. No one should have to choose between dangerous work and starvation. No one should have to accept death as a normal cost of making a living. But we've lost something too. Those men understood physics through their bodies. They didn't calculate friction coefficients on paper. They felt when the wood was too dry, when the grease was wearing thin, when the structure was starting to fail. They heard things in the creaking of timber that no instrument could measure. They knew the mountain the way you know your own house in the dark. We've traded sweat for screens. We've traded intuition for sensors. We've traded men who could feel the machine as an extension of their bodies for men who monitor readouts and respond to alarms. We're safer, but we're also disconnected. Modern loggers operate equipment from climate-controlled cabs, joysticks, and monitors replacing muscle and instinct. They're skilled, don't misunderstand me, but it's a different kind of skill. They're supervisors of machines rather than extensions of them. Something is lost in that translation. Not skill exactly, but intimacy. A connection to the physical world that can only be developed through direct contact, through consequences, through the kind of learning that happens when mistakes hurt. I'm not romanticizing danger. Danger killed too many men. Danger orphaned too many children. Danger ground too many bodies into the mountain slopes. But I'm acknowledging that the men who survived that danger, who worked within it every day, who understood it as a constant companion, they knew things we don't know anymore. They had capabilities we've lost. They were connected to the material world in ways we can only imagine. The flume tender who could hear a problem in the water flow before any instrument detected it. The goat rider who knew by the feel of the sled when a curve was going wrong. The camp boss, who could look at a trestle and know it was weakening, could sense the fatigue in the wood before it became visible. That knowledge died with them. We have other knowledge now. Better knowledge in many ways, safer knowledge, more systematically developed and transmitted. But it's not the same. And something was traded. Here's to the flume builders, the men who hung wooden troughs off cliffs with nothing but rope and nerve, who built 10-mile highways through terrain that should have been impossible, who solved engineering problems with muscle and mathematics and sheer, stubborn refusal to accept defeat. Here's to the flume tenders, who walked the edges while death rushed past at 60 miles per hour, who listened for the roar and counted the seconds, who knew that every day might be their last day and went out anyway. Here's to the log riders, who rode the goats down 10 miles of wooden track with no brakes and no way off, who chose the chutes over poverty, and sometimes lost that bet. Here's to the unnamed, the unremembered, the unmarked graves in cemeteries no one visits anymore, the bodies never recovered from canyon floors, the men who disappeared into the mountain and were forgotten before the month was out. They built the world we live in. Every board foot of lumber in every frame house, every mine that stayed open because the timbers held, every city that grew because the materials arrived. We owe them. Somewhere in a Sierra Nevada canyon, a rotting V-flume still clings to the rock. Moss covers the lumber. The trestles sag. Water damage has opened gaps in the trough, but the structure still stands, still follows the contours of the mountain, still remembers its purpose. And water still trickles through the cracks. The same mountain streams that fed the flumes 100 years ago still flow, still follow gravity, still whisper down the canyon. If you listen closely, maybe you can hear it. The echo of the roar, the thunder of timber coming down, the sound of men who worked and died and left nothing behind but stumps and stories and a few rotting boards on a mountainside. The ghosts still ride. If these stories matter to you, subscribe. There are more men to remember, more forgotten labor, more wooden highways, more history buried in mountain canyons, waiting for someone to tell it.